Hi, good day to all of you. I am Patrick Vance Nogoy, and I'm here to present my paper on the theme of urban political ecology and informal city, the possibilities of co designing with slum communities. I would like to begin by explaining the concept of urban metabolism. It's a useful concept used by many theorists about philosophy on the city to understand what the city is. This concept looks into the network of relationships among input resources, processes, and outputs, along with its environmental implications. It also helps us evaluate how residents consume resources by measuring flows and stocks as part of an ongoing debate of the normative claim that efficiency of resource and equity in consumption are essential for social well being. It might be very helpful to look at this graph, and I got this from Digist et al. 2018, page 196, to see how efficient and equity aspects of urban metabolism helps us understand the flow of resources, flows and stock of material, energy, and human knowledge, and how residents use these resources. So you have efficiency, increase in positive outputs, decrease in inputs, and how this efficient use of resources define well-being, both the individual and the social. But we also want to look into equitable distribution, whether this flow of resources helps residents achieve capabilities, and also the aspect of responsibility. Now, one of the major strands of urban metabolism is what we call urban political ecology, and its main focus is human agency, the socio economic and political dimensions of the flows and stocks of resources that happen within a certain area or in the city. Urban space and resource flows are shaped by political and economic processes and practices, and these are heavily influenced by social power and capital, according to Newell and Cousins. Through urban political ecology, we can identify uneven power relationships shaping urban space, and the goal is to foster a more sustainable and democratic form of urban environmental governance and policy making. This is my interest in this presentation, to look into urban political ecology frameworks, or what I will call from here on UPE, for us to not only better understand what happens in the city, but more so to identify factors, relationships in human agency, and the political elements that influence the resources and efficient use, and even the status of people, especially living in informal cities. And what do I mean by an informal city? Well, these are material cities in which elements and processes of space, economic exchanges, and social relations, and access to urban goods and services that occur outside law and taxation and government established structures, according to Gibrunet and Brotto. If you look at megacities in Southeast Asia, for example, Bangkok, Manila, Jakarta, and perhaps even parts of Vietnam's cities, you would see high rise buildings. You would see neighborhoods, subdivisions, and beside them, slums, or those who are living in dilapidated housing. And notice that in those communities as well, economic activities happen, political activities happen that interact with other urban spaces. And it's very telling that scarce research about the extent of access of urban dwellers in the global south and its implications on the environmental impact and the monitoring of sustainable development goals related to inequality and poverty, according to Musango and her companions. One question here is, what is our predominant vision of a city? And why is it that informal cities, according to Josephine Musango and her companions, are under researched or quite marginalized? And that's very important because we will not have a complete, realistic picture of what a city is if we don't consider the real and different residences, especially slum communities, in our research and thinking. There's also insufficient recognition of informal cities in the field of research, which leads to another challenge, the lack of localization and context, where government finds it difficult to reconcile its responsibilities and authority in dealing with uncertainties arising from rapidly changing urban systems. And slum communities, which are fixtures in the megacities of Southeast Asia, grow at a rapid rate, which strains resources, affects the flow of stock of resources, and has serious implications for environmental justice. In the case of Manila, by 2050, according to Ballesteros, it is expected that the slum population will reach around 9 million, given an annual growth rate of over 3.5% compared to urban population. And in the slum communities, there are poor living conditions, which include lack of sanitation, overcrowding, deficient water and electricity supply, and even uncertain tenure. And dwellers are exposed to pollution, noise, congestion, flooding, especially during rainy seasons, and even violence. Now, for my side, I believe that there are advantages of adopting an urban political ecological framework in thinking about slum communities and informal cities. Why UPE frameworks are more attuned to the influence of unequal social political forces shaping urban spaces. As you know, most of those who are dwelling in slum communities belong to the lower income bracket or even living barely above poverty line. They work as laborers and staff for all these companies, yet their housing, their environment have poor conditions, sometimes inhumane. Now, through UPE, we can provide a more apt structure to explore the relationship between the lack, for example, of legal status among slum dwellers and its impact on equitable participation and fair distribution of social power among stakeholders. Another advantage is when we look at the slum communities in Manila, we see that there is a distinctive urbanization process influenced by historical factors. For example, since the 1950s, those who live in the provinces, in rural areas, both near and outside Manila, come to Manila dreaming of higher economic status and job opportunities. However, over the history, there are unequal social and political relationship among actors, which also force them to remain poor. And so it is essential through a UPE perspective to investigate the network of these relationships and the nature of socioeconomic structures so that we could see the urbanization process and its implication for addressing environmental justice and developing appropriate government policies and action. However, Ryan Holifield, one distinguished author, has a critique of UPEs. He offers two objections and challenges. One, for him, UPE is limited by Marxist interpretations and categories. Instead, the crucial question is how factors, processes, and forms contribute to forming a distinctive social, rather than simply viewing them through a capitalist lens. In other words, if we just focus on the economic and political dimension exclusively, then we leave out other processes and factors and assessments that will help us gain a holistic interpretation of what's happening in an urban space like slum communities. Another challenge is what he calls anthropocentrism challenge. He says that UPE frameworks are too centered on human beings, forgetting that there are non human elements and agents in urban space. And because they're only viewed in the themes of inequality, domination, and capital interest, we risk a resurgence of nature and society dualism. That means you only have nature on the other side, and it's interpreted only according to the power relations and human benefits and effects, instead of recognizing nature as one agent in urban space. Now, what would be a good responses to his critique? In my case, if we look into the case of slum communities, we see that the socioeconomic dimension is necessary and urgent. And against the anthropocentrism challenge, we can adopt Anne Rademacher's definition of what nature is, which is an outcome of the interaction between the biophysical settings, for example, rivers, land area, processes, and human disturbances. So we can trace the impact of slum activities in slums to to its surroundings. Some slums live near the canals in Manila, for example, and we could trace the effects. And the term nature instead is focused on the interaction of the residents and human agency with its environment. Another response would be this. Since UPE frameworks examine historical processes and biophysical dynamics in human interactions, it offers a more holistic understanding of environmental issues in slum communities. Such an approach supports prioritizing urgent needs and addressing them effectively. So, what I'm saying is that inevitably we have to prioritize certain issues, and the socioeconomic and the environmental impact are urgent issues. But when you look at slum communities, it's really the relationship, the unequal relationship, that takes a lot of attention but has been neglected by a lot of researchers and government policies. But I do partially agree with Holyfield that this strategy is motivated by Marxism and anthropocentric categories, but it should not be limited this way. So, what do I propose? Well, perhaps we look into the concept of capabilities and see whether a capability based UPE framework can do the job. Now, what is this capabilities approach? To avoid falling into a narrow Marxist interpretation, I propose a UPE framework based on certain principles of the capability approach. Capabilities, according to Amartya Sen, is a combination of functionings, which is things a person values doing or being that are feasible for individuals to achieve. Focusing on capabilities allows tracking of human freedom, which aligns with SDG goals. It helps explain the implications of current socio-economic conditions, to identify areas of social and political inequality where residents need emancipation or increased freedom. So we can pinpoint locations for co designing the environment with them. But to do this effectively, according to Josephine Mosango and company, SDG targets and measurements need to be adapted at the local level and scaled down. So, if we want to co design with people, data collection analysis must depend on local samples. We have to go and look and interview those who are living in slums and see how they look into their situation for effective co designing to happen. For example, Sustainable Development Goal number 11 states that cities and human settlements should be inclusive, safe, and resilient and sustainable. Now, in case of Manila slum communities, co-designing for safe and security involves examining relevant functionings and allocating resources toward achieving a capability level that ensures a secure environment. So we look into the level of freedom that would define safety and security. And these strategies may include solutions that already are present in that community, such as trust in relationship among neighbors. In conclusion, I've talked about urban metabolism, which is an approach to understanding the elements and process and dynamics of an informal city. And I chose UPE. And for me, the primary advantage of UPE lies in their capacity to monitor the unequal distribution of social and political powers, especially in the case of slum communities. And then lastly, co designing with them means avoiding traditional government policies such as forced evacuation, provision of alternative housing, or eviction. And co designing now will be based on capabilities, their level of freedom, and they should be involved as agents and not merely beneficiaries of social services and government policies. I do hope this presentation provoked you to think about it more. And I suggest certain readings that you could see on the screen right now, which I've used in my presentation and my paper. And I do hope that this presentation helps us to think about informal cities, especially those who are poor and neglected. Thank you very much.